So once again, thanks for joining us for this webinar with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, where we'll discuss digital green bonds and the bond data taxonomy. And good afternoon or good morning, depending what time zone you're in. My name is Gabriel Callsen, Senior Director for FinTech and Digitalization at ICMA. I am delighted to be joined today by Georgina Lok, Head Market Development at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, and Nicholas Young, Manager Market Development at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. FinTech and digitalization remain key priorities for ICMA and our membership, be it issuers, investors, banks, law firms, market infrastructures, and services providers. It is a theme that impacts every single stakeholder of international debt capital markets. This is reflected in the engagement on FinTech and digitalization across our various constituencies who come together to share insights into innovation, promote market efficiency, and foster harmonization through common standards globally. With over 400 individuals in our various working groups and committees across our membership of more than 600 firms. And the work is fully aligned with ICMA's mission statement to promote resilient and well-functioning cross-border capital markets. Indeed, ICMA is known for its standards and best practices for the issuance of international securities, the rules that underpin secondary markets trading, the Global Master Repurchase Agreement, and the Best Practice Guide for repos, as well as the principles for sustainable finance. The digital transformation across capital markets and beyond continues to accelerate at pace, which means that for us, we have to adapt and evolve to stay aligned, to foster innovation, promote market efficiency, but also manage the risks of market fragmentation. The development of data standards and models plays a critical role, and this goes a step further than our traditional standards. The Bond Data Taxonomy is a key component for bond markets, as well as the Common Domain Model, or CDM, a cross-industry initiative between ICMA, ISDA, and ISLA to streamline and automate derivatives, securities lending, and repo transactions end-to-end, from execution, trade, and post-trade reporting. A priority for ICMA is to facilitate the implementation of best practices, for example, of payoffs, a form of bilateral netting in repos. That said, we have also been developing with our members a digital assets annex to the GIMRA, to cater to our members' needs who transact in tokenized securities and digital forms of cash in repo transactions. Fostering the development of digital or DLT-based bond markets as a reliable source of funding for the real economy is a strategic objective for ICMA. Indeed, we continue to see an increasing number of digital bond transactions globally, supported by changes in legal and regulatory frameworks, and indeed the launch of wholesale CBDCs and other forms of digital cash. This is a key focus for ICMA's DLT Bonds Working Group, which is chaired by Christoph Hock at Union Investment, which highlights the importance also to the buy side. Capital markets also play a crucial role to fund sustainable economic growth. Earlier this year, we celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the Green Bond Principles. Yesterday, ICMA held its annual conference of the principles in Amsterdam. That is the Green, Social, Sustainability, and Sustainability-Linked Bond Principles. The principles are the global standard for the 5 trillion sustainable bond market that represents the largest source of market finance dedicated to sustainability and climate transition. At the annual conference yesterday, we published further guidance for green enabling projects and guidelines for sustainability-linked loan financing bonds. And earlier this year, the government of Hong Kong issued digital green bonds in alignment with ICMA's Bond Data Taxonomy. Hong Kong was the first sovereign supranational and agency issuer. It is a first for digital or DLT-based bond, and it is also first for green bond. And this marked a significant milestone to foster interoperability and scalability of DLT-based bond markets. So once again, I'm delighted to be joined today by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Now, looking at the agenda, we will discuss the multi-currency digital green bond issuance, the key features of the issuance, the benefits for issuers and investors, as well as the opportunities, challenges, and lessons learned. We will then discuss how the Bond Data Taxonomy was implemented, starting with an introduction to digitalization debt capital markets and the key features of the Bond Data Taxonomy. And we will reflect on the lessons learned and the evolution of digital or DLT-based bond markets looking ahead. Now, importantly, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and we have a Q&A session. You can submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we will answer questions at the end. This session will be recorded and made available on ICMA's website. So with this, I will hand over to Georgina. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel, and hello, everyone. I'm Georgina from the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. We're delighted to be here today with ICMA on doing a webinar on digital green bond issuance and the bond data taxonomy. I guess for Hong Kong, in general, as an international financial center and a green finance hub of Asia, we see the merit of embracing innovation and adopting technologies that hold the potential to generate efficiency gains, reduce costs, enhance transparency, and facilitate greater investor participation in the bond market. We very much welcome ICMA's initiative to develop the BDT to support automation in bond markets and appreciate the opportunity to talk about our experience in adopting the BDT today. Before we go into the more detailed discussion of the BDT itself, let us take the opportunity to briefly go over, our own, digital bond issuance earlier this year to set a bit of context before for the discussion later on. So I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague Nick, who will take us through a few slides on our issuance. Thanks.
Thanks, Regina. So just taking a step back to let you know where this all started. The HKMA actually started its tokenization journey with Project Genesis back in 2021, which we worked on in collaboration with the BIS Innovation Hub in Hong Kong. This was a proof of concept exercise where we successfully concept tested the issuance of tokenized green bonds in Hong Kong. So after this, we took this forward to an actual real money transaction. And we successfully issued 2 tokenized green bonds in the past 2 years in February 2023 and 2024, respectively. The proceeds of these issuances were ultimately applied towards financing or refinancing projects that fell under the eligible categories and set out in the Hong Kong government's green bond framework. And the slide shown on the screen sort of gives a high-level overview and timeline of our tokenization journey so far. So yeah, building on the success of our inaugural tokenized green bond issuance last February, we successfully issued a second tokenized issuance on the 7th of February, 2024. And this was issued in 4 major currencies, Hong Kong dollar, RMB, USD, and Euro, for a cumulative total of around 750 million USD equivalent. And yeah, this was the first multi-currency digital bond issued in the world. So yeah, the size of this issuance brought it much closer to the size of conventional green bonds that we have issued in the past, and it attracted a subscription from a pretty wide range of global investors. This included asset managers, banks, insurance companies, and private banks, as well as non-financial institutions. The bond was issued in digitally native format, which helped streamline the entire issuance process. On the green side of it, issuing this format also helped enhance transparency and accessibility to green bond disclosures. So we actually had all the key documentation available for viewing by the parties who onboarded onto the platform. They could view it directly on the platform. So this included the Hong Kong government's green bond framework, as well as the relevant third-party reports related to this issuance. Another key feature of the issuance was the built-in standardization elements, which we did by adopting the ICMA's Bond Data Taxonomy. We are actually the first government issuer and the first green bond issuer to adopt the ICMA's BDT. In our view, since this is a machine-readable language, which can be more widely adopted across the market, this could potentially pave the way for further promoting automation of documents and cross-system interoperability for the market. Yeah, later in this presentation, we will go into more detail on our implementation of BDT. Yeah, so just to share a bit more about the structure of our second issuance, One of the important innovations that we added from the inaugural issuance was an investor access model, which gave more options for investors to access the issuance and to help overcome some of the hurdles that they typically encounter when accessing digital bonds. So the diagram on the slide visualizes the three options that we offer to the investors. Option one at the top of the screen was for the investors to directly onboard onto the digital assets platform, which allowed them to access the issuance. Option two, just under that, was to establish arrangements with a custodian that had directly onboarded onto the digital platform. So yeah, for these two options, from what we heard from the market, each required a certain level of legal or technical adjustments and deviations from existing processes from conventional issuances, which may not have been suitable for all types of investors. So in our recent issuance, we also explored opening up another model, which is option 3 here towards the bottom of the screen, which essentially made investor access a lot more easier. So in essence, investors were able to access the bond via existing market structures which meant they had the option to buy the bond as existing members of the CMU or through the CMU's existing linkages with either Euroclear or Clearstream. Of course, depending on each investor's own investment policies or applicable regulatory environment, there may be due diligence and internal approvals that they need to go through. But from an operational perspective, they did not need to necessarily directly interact with the digital platform directly. And in the case of option 3 in particular, all processes were largely business as usual. So yeah, offering this sort of this option to the market helped us broaden our investor reach compared to the first issuance. Yeah, so having said that, we do recognize that the model we adopted for our issuances might not be fully replicable across the market. However, we do hope that at least our efforts and for these true transactions, we've shown sort of the important considerations that are worth noting, and we can gradually create a demonstrative effect to the market and get other participants in the market interested and to start readying themselves to embrace DLT and all this other game-changing technology. In terms of next steps, we very much hope that we can continue to promote the wider adoption of tokenization in financial markets, and to this end, we'll keep working with other stakeholders to explore further use cases, technologies, as well as look at other potential solutions to support greater cross-platform and cross-system interoperability. So I'll just hand back over to Georgina now to close out this presentation.
Thanks, Nick. So we'd like to thank the organizers, ICMA, and the participants today for the opportunity to share our experience in our digital bond issuance. And just to remind everyone, I've been to ask your questions at the Q&A box. I think the button is on the bottom of the screen. I think I see a few questions coming in already, so keep them coming. And so now I guess it's time to switch back and talk more about the ICMA's own Bond Data Taxonomy. And I'm going to pass it over back to Gabriel and invite him to speak a bit more and tell us a bit more about the background, the vision, and the mechanics of the taxonomy.
Yes, thank you, Nick and Georgina, for sharing these insights into this groundbreaking transaction earlier this year. So when it comes to the Bond Data Taxonomy, perhaps we can take a step back and look at the genesis of the taxonomy and the broader background and market evolution that drove us to develop the Bond Data Taxonomy together with our members. So when we look at what's driving digitalization in debt capital markets, and when we hone in on, I guess, the issuance process in particular, there's broadly different drivers at play. For example, in particular, automation and efficiency, and this manifests itself in the increasing number of vendor solutions who are trying to tackle different parts of the issuance process, there's also simply revenue growth. And this is, for example, not only in fintech solutions, but also in the use of DLT and tokenization. DLT on the one hand to streamline operations, tokenization to create securities in a digital native format. Those drivers can also go hand in hand, of course. But also when you look at it globally, it's also a matter of competitiveness, where regulators and policymakers across the globe have made changes to their legal framework to accommodate the use of DLT and blockchain in financial markets and realize the benefits in terms of greater efficiency, transparency, and ultimately facilitating access as well. So this is, I guess, the high-level background. When we look at the evolution at ICMA, we've kept track of the number of different vendor solutions for a number of years now. When you first started in 2018, 2019, there were just about I think it was 18, 19 different vendor solutions. This has grown over the last few years. Most recently, when we took stock, we had over 45, and we're currently in the process of reviewing the directory that lists all the different solutions. So there's interesting dynamics because there's different solution providers emerging, which is a characteristic of prime markets. So when we look at DCM processes, and these are applicable no matter whether it's a traditional security or a digital or DLT-based security, there's in principle always a number of steps. Some of them are sequential and non-sequential. We can break this down into 5 different steps. It could be more or fewer. But in essence, when we look at the process of issuing securities, whether it's at the stage of origination and the legal documentation that is created, the deal announcement, book building, allocation, pricing, closing, and settlement. And there will be nuances depending on the type of transaction, whether it is indeed a private placement or if it's a public transaction. At the same time, when we look at these, at the process diagram here and the different solutions that are being developed by market stakeholders, we can see that there's a number of those, whether it's for roadshow logistics, whether it's pre-trade analytics, whether it's for the generation of legal documents, communication of deal terms, order submissions from investors to syndicate banks or to the issuer, order book aggregation, reconciliation, things like access to the book building process, pricing tools, post-trade connectivity, workflow. And when it comes to DLT and tokenization, there's either DLT to streamline processes, operate networks, for example, or to provide additional services around, for example, custody of DLT-based instruments, which gives rise to particular considerations. But the main point really is that there's a growing number of vendor solutions on the one hand, but none of those provides an end-to-end solution for bond issuance, nor does any of the market stakeholders. So in this respect, interoperability is key indeed to avoid, on the one hand, market fragmentation, but also to realize the benefits of DLT to achieve greater market efficiency and straight-through processing. So this is the background against which we developed the Bond Data Taxonomy to be a common denominator or common language. Now, you've spoken about the BDT and that you implemented it for the issuance of the digital green bonds. Just to focus, to give you a high-level overview here of what the Bond Data Taxonomy is in essence. So in essence, it's standardized. On the one hand, terms are standardized and it's machine readable. We first released it back in 2023. So developed this taxonomy with a working group that represents a broad range of stakeholders, including issuers, investors, but also banks, large ones, small ones, market infrastructures, law firms, but also services providers. And what the BDT covers essentially is what you would typically find in a term sheet. So around 140 terms, including subcategories and enumerations. And then earlier this year, we released an update to the Bond Data Taxonomy, which included a DLT extension, which enables participants to capture DLT-related information that you may find in a term sheet. And I'll come back to that. And we also included a number of general minor enhancements, but the core of the Bond Data Taxonomy remained the same. An important aspect for us was not to reinvent the wheel. And where relevant, we did incorporate existing ISO data definitions and formats where they existed. But when you looked at the primary market process, many of those elements did not exist in the ISO data dictionary and other ISO standards. So further information on the stakeholders involved and all the different types of firms are available on the website. Now, to give you a more tangible insight into what the bond data taxonomy looks like, on the left-hand side here, you will find standardized key information that you may find in a term sheet. So that was the starting point when we developed the bond data taxonomy. Things like security identifiers, so anything that's related to the security itself, so the bond on the one hand, then parties that are involved in the transaction, whether it's issuers, banks, investors, agents, and so on. And then there's also the additional information that forms part of the issuance process. So the governing law under which the security is issued, whether it's listed or not, selling restrictions, and so on. And then with the DLT extension as well, additional information on the DLT platform operator. This was then translated into machine-readable formats. The bond data taxonomy is not just a list of terms, it is available in an XML format. And it also has a structure, so categorizing the information and dividing it into, on the one hand, the product or the security-related information, where you will find the identifier, maturity, interest, payment frequency, and so on, day count conventions. Then another category for parties, capturing all different types of parties that are involved in a transaction, and then the additional information that forms part of the transaction. In terms of machine readability, this is an important aspect that previously was missing, where when you look at guidance that exists, whether it's vendor specifications, ICMA's primary market handbook, but also other documentation by market infrastructures, a missing element here was for it to be machine readable. And this is why we created this in XML. Why XML? Because it's a commonly used machine readable format. It is widespread. It facilitates the exchange of information electronically. So it includes embedded validation rules. Without becoming too technical, it enables participants to share and distribute information and do this in an automated manner, validating the information that is shared. And importantly, when you look at this here, it might not look as familiar if you're not familiar with technical standards and data modeling, but it's nonetheless human readable. And the way it can be used is, and we'll come back to the use case here, how HKMA implemented it, but it can be used for a very broad range of purposes. One is simply to represent the economic terms of a security for the purpose of settling a transaction, for example, to embed this into a smart contract, which was demonstrated at a hackathon held last year by Société Générale in Paris. Vendor firms have also implemented it to create a securities platform to manage securities and the life cycle aimed at agents. This is the example of the startup investor, or create a database. But it can also be used to create the bond documentation funnel terms, something that now CM has incorporated in their legal documentation solution. Now, to come back to the DLT-rated element, it's interesting because there's an increasing number of transactions, and the transaction by HKMA is indeed very interesting when you look at the different DLT elements. In light of this, of the increasing number and the activity in the market, but together with the working group, we spent months to create an extension that allows participants to capture DLT-related bond information. So when you look at the taxonomy, on the one hand, there's a list of standardized elements that are machine readable. And then in the DLT extension, there's a structure that allows you to capture DLT-related information. A lot of this currently is not standardized. But with this framework in the bond data taxonomy, you can capture key information that changes hands, that is exchanged electronically, and that may be referenced in the prospectus or term sheet. For example, the DLT platform operator, here as an example, HSBC Orion or SG Forge. The field type, in this case, it's a free text, and the data type is a string, or an identifier that might be required for the platform operator, whether it's a MIC code or a DTI, and this is predefined from a list that that we included in the taxonomy. Again, the data type here is a string, so it's just it's simply text. Then the type of DLT platform, whether it's, as an example here, a Hyperledger Fabric, R3 Recorder, and there's many others as well. Again, this is a free text that can be incorporated. Accessibility features, whether it's a private network, whether it's public permissioned, whether it's a consortium, and so on. And again, there's a list of different options here. And then also a token technical reference, whether it is based on an ERC20 token or ERC 1400. Again, it's a free text depending on what is being used. And there's a lot more information that can be captured by using the Bond Data Taxonomy structure. Now, this example here will speak to many and resonate in particular with practitioners, front office functions. On the other hand, the Bond Data Taxonomy is essentially in an XML format. So what you see on the right-hand side here is the XML example, where you will recognize some of the terms. So what you see on the left-hand side is available in the XML schema. The left-hand side is how you could represent it. So it could be in a spreadsheet, it could be also in a website, but I'll come back to that particular aspect here. So how to use it? There's essentially two ways of implementing the Bond Data Taxonomy. One is to integrate it into existing systems or documents in a term sheet, for example, in a database or in a software, smart contracts or particular token standards, so that it is used natively. So the terms of the BDT are fully embedded and they are used from the outset. The other option is to map to it. So when we go back to the process of bond issuance, but the broader bond lifecycle, and the different parties that are involved and the data that is transmitted or that is communicated electronically, there will be many bilateral mappings between all different stakeholders. And the option here is to simply use the Bond Data Taxonomy as the common denominator that participants map to. And this, again, can be integrated in collaboration tools and systems, whether it is to distribute information on your new deal announcement, whether it's simply to embed it into an Excel spreadsheet, something as simple as that, whether it's to embed it into a website where the information, say the term sheet, is displayed and the XML schema can be downloaded, or into an API to communicate with a database where the information is stored. And importantly, it is something that is designed to be used by all stakeholders in the value chain. So whether it is issuers, agents, investors, banks, services providers, all stakeholders that are involved in the transaction. So with this, in terms of benefits, the important aspect here is that it's publicly available and free to use indeed. So it has been developed by bond market practitioners and experts from relevant stakeholders. And what I want to highlight here is that it is something that has been developed by the value chain. So it is not just a single constituency that has worked on this, that has developed the Bond Data Taxonomy, but it's a collaborative effort across the market. But importantly, it's also vendor and technology agnostic. So the structure of the Bond Data Taxonomy, the XML files can easily be integrated into various systems and technology architectures. So facilitating the exchange of data so you avoid the risks of vendor lock-in, for example. But importantly as well, a debt security ultimately remains a debt security, no matter whether it is issued in a traditional format or a native digital format on a DLT network or blockchain. And the BDT has been successfully implemented for traditional securities as well as for DLT or digital securities. So with the aim to promote STP and importantly foster interoperability from issuance, trading and settlement to distribution. But with it, perhaps Georgina, I can turn back to you and understand from you what your approach was to implementing the Bond Data Taxonomy and what your experiences were.
Sure. Maybe just to share a bit on what drove us to this idea of adopting the BDT. I think when we are looking into our tokenization project, we've been looking for the new and innovative solutions that can improve Hong Kong's capital markets in general, and that extends beyond DLT. So for our second issuance, we worked closely with ICMA to implement the BDT, and we're glad to be the first SSA issuer and green bond to have used this taxonomy. So under conventional issuances, many processes, in particular the documentation aspect of the transactions, those are mostly done manually. And we thought this is generally very time consuming and can be subject to human error. So by adopting machine readable and common language like the BDT, we see the potential to make the entire process more efficient by allowing bond information to be exchanged between parties in a more streamlined and standardized manner. And furthermore, this common language can also help pave the way towards promoting cross-system and cross-platform interoperability, which we think are very important aspects if we want to promote wider adoption of technology in capital markets. So this is what drove us to adopt the BDT in our second tokenized issuance. So in order to align ourselves, with the BDT, HSBC, which was our platform operator, they undertook a mapping exercise on its platform Orion to identify the bond shell data fields needed to be amended to align with the BDT data fields. So we understand that there were currently 63 unique data fields on the Orion bond shell, and for our issuance, HSBC has managed to at least fundamentally align 42 of these data fields with the ICMA BDT. While the remaining 21 data fields, we understand on Orion, were not part of the taxonomy itself. So to make these alignments, some amendments were made to the data fields on the Orion platform. For example, issuer was amended as issuer name, and issuer price percentage was changed to issue price, and frequency to interest payment frequency, etc. So we believe this alignment with BDT was important, as it was a first step in promoting automation interoperability in capital market processes. I think another point that we appreciate about BDT is the technology agnostic aspect of it, especially at this juncture, when we see that the technology adoption is still quite early in terms of stage of development, and many may still rely on the traditional processes and infrastructure. So this is also partly why we, for our second issuance, we decided to link our issuance with the traditional, financial market infrastructure to allow, an additional option for those who may not have, adopted the technology yet. So going forward, as you can see, this is still, sort of like a moving learning process and at this development stage. So we look forward to further collaborating with ICMA to work on, future collaborations and enhance transparency and efficiency in markets. So, and turning back to you, Gabriel, based on your, understanding of market so far, can you talk a bit more about, market adoption of the BDT so far and, ICMA's next steps going forward?
Yes, of course. And perhaps I can just pick up on the points that you made in terms of scope of the bond data taxonomy and going back to the different implementation approaches in terms of integration and mapping. So it can be a combination of the two. In terms of scope, when we first developed the bond data taxonomy and we looked at the universe of existing data specifications from different participants, be it vendor firms, be it market infrastructures, information that is typically included in the prospectus or circular. It is, of course, I think the main question here is really what are the key elements that are exchanged with participants? And indeed, there are a number of elements that are important for, let's say, settlement processes, for detailed processes, where the information may not necessarily be shared across a broader group of participants, which is why the BDT covers, let's say, the core of what a security constitutes. We may consider going forward to expand it further, but it is really about the information that changes hands and that is communicated electronically. So that's, I think, fully expected in terms of the implementation, but also to reiterate from our perspective that we've been delighted to be collaborating with HKMA and the various stakeholders on this issuance. Now, when it comes to adoption, adoption, there's the, I guess, landmark transactions like the one that you conducted earlier this year. There are others that are underway. There's vendor firms who have implemented already, for whom it has saved indeed also a lot of time. Because often when it comes to developing software solutions, whether it's in debt capital markets or secondary or repo, going from, I guess, a workflow into the technical build takes a lot of time, and the decisions have to be made how to represent and categorize it, how to categorize a transaction, the data within a transaction. So our focus here is, on the one hand, DCM processes to continue fostering automation and interoperability within DCM, but more broadly across the life cycle. Another important focus is indeed digital bonds and supporting the evolution of this market segment. And it's quite encouraging to see how easy it is to implement the bond data taxonomy beyond the use cases explored so far, but also in ERC token standards and smart contracts. So in terms of adoption has been encouraging since we launched the bond data taxonomy. Only a few weeks later, the first vendor firm announced back then that they had already adopted it for their legal documentation solution. Others have built their platform onto that. Market infrastructures are currently also implementing it, and there's going to be more information to be publicly announced in due course on this. Now, in terms of vision and focus looking ahead, it is, I guess I think just to actually highlight the points, or to kind of pick up on the points that you highlighted, private market stakeholders have a key role to play. And I think it's important to, when we take a step back, to look at this, because often the market as it currently works is fragmented to some extent between primary and secondary repo and collateral markets on the other hand. But there's an opportunity with digital bonds in particular to create a golden source and use the taxonomy as a standard from the outset, and to facilitate SDP across the life cycle. And there's in particular a role or responsibility for issuers to drive digitalization of capital markets, since this is where, I guess, the security originates from. We are, of course, talking about the operational foundation. So this is really focused on operational processes to foster interoperability in debt capital markets, and in particular for scaling digital bond markets. And there's, on the other hand, legal and regulatory aspects and challenges around that between different frameworks in different jurisdictions. And of course, the question around digital cash as well, wholesale CBDC, how digital securities or DLT-based securities can be settled, which are beyond, I guess, the scope of the bond data taxonomy as such, but they are complementary. So from our perspective, collaboration remains critical with not only market stakeholders, but also regulators. Standards and models like the bond data taxonomy play a critical component, or a critical part, to foster the overall evolution of digital bond markets, help this market segment scale. But there's, of course, more than data formats and standards. We are currently working on a framework for digital securities, which is underpinned by common standards on the one hand. There's a format, and then there's a question around workflow automation, in particular smart contracts and guidelines in terms of key considerations for different stakeholders who either have already conducted their own transactions or others who want to get involved. So this is a key focus, and the bond data taxonomy is a critical part of that. But there's another legal dimension as well when it comes to risk factors and disclosure. And it is something that we explored last year in our publication on risk factors and disclosure and DLT bond offering documents, to understand if there was a level of convergence between the different issuances globally, and understand to what extent there is a similarity when it comes to at least the DLT specific risks that have been identified, which I think is fair to say that there is a level of similarity that we found, whether it's technology risks, whether it relates to the evolution of the regulatory framework, but of course, secondary market liquidity due to challenges around connectivity, which we seek to address with the bond data taxonomy, but there's other elements to this. But clearly, it is also an aspect that remains specific to every single issuer. So overall, our focus going forward is or continues to be to promote convergence and interoperability within debt capital markets. So looking at it holistically, DCM traditionally, but also digital or DLT-based securities. And just to reiterate here, that dialogue and collaboration with regulators and policymakers on these topics remain key. But with that, perhaps Georgina, back to you in terms of what are the next steps from your perspective? How do you see the evolution going forward?
Sure. Sorry, just before that, I just wanted to make a correction of one of what I mentioned earlier, the HSBC. I think I meant to say HSBC as the platform provider instead of operator, because the operator of the it's actually our central money markets unit, which is the central securities depository established and operated by the HKMA to provide clearing, settlement, and custodian service for debt securities. So the platform operator is the CMU, while the platform provider is the HSBC. I just want to make that quick correction. And in terms of next steps, I think we definitely look forward to continuing working with ICMA and other key industry players in terms of really looking at what else we can explore in terms of use cases and what aspects, what things we can do more to promote wider adoption. Because I think at the end of the day, both in terms of this technology and also the BDT itself, I think wider adoption is key, right? So it won't make sense if it's just us adopting one taxonomy. There's a common language which requires many people using it. So that is definitely one area that we'll continue to work on, and also in terms of exploring further use cases, and in terms of linking the technology with the green aspect, not only just for the government's own green bond program, but also going forward for the market itself, in terms of how technology can help better support green finance, in terms of enhancing accessibility, transparency, and also traceability. For instance, not just applying DLT, but also other technologies like Internet of Things and things like that to better track and report, such as use of proceeds of the bonds or whatever securities issued, and also how the proceeds are used. I think that will generally be very important going forward, especially the rising trend. In general, investors have been setting a higher bar in terms of requiring more transparency and more information on where where proceeds are going.
Okay, great. That's certainly an interesting perspective, and clearly, I think wider adoption will help further the automation and digitalization journey across capital markets, bridging also the gap, as we discussed, between, on the one hand, traditional securities and digital or DLT-based securities. And of course, I think it's really interesting that this was a green bond and that the information, as you mentioned, has been made available on the digital assets platform. And of course, I think technology indeed has a critical, very important role to play to also further the sustainability agenda, whether it is in terms of measuring the impact. But of course, this is likely to be specific to the different projects on the one hand, and then the ability to measure an impact specifically. So with that, I see that here in the question answers, we have received 25 questions, which is great. I think we will look through the questions briefly and try to answer as many as we can in the remaining 15 minutes that we have. So from what I can see here, there are a number of questions in terms of accessibility. How to access the Bond Data Taxonomy. Just to answer this question here up front, so on the website, and there's a link in the presentation that is going to be made available, you will find a link to the Bond Data Taxonomy where you can download it, where you, on the one hand, you have a reference sheet, and I will show it quickly here on the slide. So you have a reference sheet, which is essentially an Excel spreadsheet, so easy to read, which gives you an idea of the different fields in the Bond Data Taxonomy. You will also find the XML data elements of the Bond Data Taxonomy. And then there is the user guide that explains how to use it, and the actual ICMA common definition files. So all of this is available on the Bond Data Taxonomy website, together also with examples. So to understand if there's a transaction, what would this actually look like in the Bond Data Taxonomy? We have included a number of examples, both of traditional securities, but also DLT-based securities. So looking at the questions here, there are a number of questions on the green aspects of the transaction.
Yeah, I'm happy to take. I think generally there's thanks for everyone, for sending the questions. I think there are a few themes. I'm not going to try and address each and every one of them because they are quite a lot of them, and then some I might not be able to go into very detailed. But I think generally there's questions circling around, the green aspect, how the proceeds are used for our bond issuance, investors, how they participate and their reaction towards, our issuance, and also, primary and secondary market activity. I think these are the three themes I glanced through the questions I got so far. So I'm going to try and address these three. So in terms of the bond itself, our bond, the government green bond, the Hong Kong government green bond, is a use of proceeds bond. So I think there was a question about collateral. So that doesn't really apply in our case. So ours is a use of proceeds bond. So once we issue the bond, the proceeds goes to the government's capital works fund, which in turn the proceeds will be specifically allocated to green projects, capital projects in Hong Kong, which fall into one of the 9 categories of the government's green bond framework. And so these 9 categories include renewable energy, energy efficiency and conservation, pollution prevention and control, waste management and resources, and resource recovery, water and waste management, nature conservation / biodiversity, clean transportation, green buildings, and climate change adaptation. So far, the bonds issued. So besides, the digital bonds that we have issued, the government has also issued conventional, green bonds. So all of those proceeds have been used to so far over 70 projects, green projects of the Hong Kong government. And the allocation is done by, there's a governing steering committee that decides, how each bond the proceeds are allocated to our projects. In terms of investor, I think for the second issuance, I think Nick mentioned earlier, we have this innovation of linking it with the traditional financial infrastructure, which has allowed this additional option for investors to participate as more or less business as usual process, operationally at least. Our understanding is during our issuance process is that despite the fact that the issuance operationally it's sort of business as usual. I think for some investors, they did have to go through some internal approval, because to some of them it might be sort of like a new asset class that they have to seek approval for and things like that. And in general, there were more questions to trying to understand this digital format, what our plans are in terms of tokenization. I think. But the feedback has been quite positive. For our second issuance, we managed to issue at a much larger size compared to our first issuance, and up to, as Nick has mentioned earlier in his presentation, around $750 million US, and in 4 different currencies. And the investor base actually was quite broad. We had financial institutions, asset managers, private banks, and in addition, we also have insurance companies and also non-financial corporates as well. So we did manage to reach a pretty broad investor base, and I think one of the things that after doing 2 issuances, I think so far we've managed to that there's been quite a lot of interest in that area. I think there's been quite a lot of inquiries, both from investors and potential issuers, just talking to us, asking understanding more about our experience, the process that we had to go through, the general reaction to our issuances. So I think these are all quite positive, elements, feedback that we've got, so far, and we're happy to, share more on our experience, through occasions like this. And as I said, earlier, we will continue to look for additional use cases and ways to, facilitate broader adoption. And then just briefly on, primary and secondary market activity. So after the issuance, on the issuance of the bond on the primary market, there is also secondary market activities, and for indeed we have secondary market activity of our digital bonds in both of our issuances.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering these questions. There's one question that I would also like to add to around the due diligence processes, whether it's materially different from those done for standard bond issuance. Indeed, this is something that we have been discussing within the buy-side subgroup of our DLT bonds working group. And the short answer is yes, there are additional considerations based on those considerations, not only by the buy side, but also by issuers in particular and by banks involved in those transactions, market infrastructures, and law firms as well. We have drawn up a list of key considerations and guidance around this topic. This is currently something that ICMA's DLT bonds working group has been developing and working on, but it is something that we will also publish and distribute more broadly in due course. But it is indeed an important topic. It's of course to some extent going to be specific to each type of participant or investor as well, depending on their mandate as well and the jurisdiction and the regulator. At the same time, there are a number of considerations that many participants had to consider when either investing in tokenized securities or digital securities or issuing DLT-based securities.
Right. Just to also add on that as well, for in terms of it on the issuer side, we did try to share our experience in a more, organized manner in like a paper that we issued back in 2023, which laid out all the considerations that we had when we were doing our first issuance. So hopefully serving as reference for those who are thinking about doing this. And yeah, we look forward to any feedback from both buy side and also issue side. We welcome ideas and how to encourage more people to take up this this technology adoption, or think more about this field or investing in digital issuances.
There are questions around the settlement. So settlement and CBDC. Is this something that you would like to elaborate on? There's also other questions addressed on the bond data taxonomy, if not, that I can take first.
Oh, yeah, no. So yeah, I was gonna say, I think I missed out the one on settlement. So typically the cash like of the tokenized bond, the payments and settlement part, that it can be done either on the digital assets platform or off platform with fiat cash. So for both the two issuances we had, for the first issuance, we actually did the settlement on platform with a cash token, which is akin to CBDC, and for that, it was by the cash tokens were minted on the digital asset platform itself. And for the second issuance, we did the payments off platform. The payments were made with fiat cash, as in conventional bond issuances. So we try both, and so there are two, but not CBDC. It's more a platform, minted on the platform cash token.
Okay, great. There's a question: how is BDT being rolled out to market participants other than in the digital bond ecosystem, financial institutions, investment banks? Perhaps just if I understand the question correctly, financial institutions, investment banks are indeed part of our working group, and the bond data taxonomy is publicly available. So from that perspective, it is, on the one hand, we work through our working group to assist members in implementing the bond data taxonomy, maintaining also the bond data taxonomy. On the other hand, we also do this on a bilateral basis. In other cases, we actually might not be aware who's using it because it is publicly available, and it is, I guess, the side effect of making it publicly accessible that we may not be necessarily aware of who else is using it. But the answer is we are working collectively together to promote adoption of it. There's another question with regard to ESG data, whether these are captured in the bond data taxonomy. So I'm just looking at the question here. So given the focus on promoting sustainability in green finance, especially with the adoption of BDT for digital bonds in Hong Kong, do you foresee any potential plans or considerations for integrating the common ground taxonomy to further enhance transparency and environmental impact assessment in green bond issuances? So there's, I think, different questions here. If we look at the life cycle consideration at the issuance and trading process of a bond, on the one hand, kind of the process automation and digital representation of the product, and then automation of the processes around that. There's then the question around the use of proceeds, tracing how it is being, what the impact is, how it is being used. ICMA has published, in fact, a template for impact reporting database services providers. So there's a template that is precisely aimed at those who provide data sources for this. The question really is, at the point of a transaction when a bond is issued, a green bond, what is the extra information that needs to be included and shared with all participants as part of the issuance, as part of the settlement, and so on? So that's one question. The other one is, what is all the information that needs to be available outside this process in time when it comes to annual reports on green bonds? So it is something we have considered extending the bond data taxonomy to also capture certain ESG-related data elements. And this is very much going to be driven by participants who have an interest in this. We haven't taken any firm decision on whether to go ahead. There's individual participants who have expressed interest, but in particular from a reporting perspective, which is a slightly different angle, but one that we are also looking at. Now, there's also common ground taxonomy that is referred to here, which is something separate, I guess, and we may come back on this separately. So looking at any other questions, are there any other questions that we may have missed? And just looking at the time, importantly, it is now, we have now been going for an hour, and I think, unfortunately, it is now time to wrap up, but we will take this away and see to what extent we can answer the remaining questions here that have been shared and distribute them amongst participants. So with this, Georgina and Nick, I'd like to thank you again for joining us for this webinar and for sharing your invaluable insights into this transaction, issuing digital green bonds, and also adopting ICMA's bond data taxonomy, the lessons learned, and clearly also the opportunities lying ahead. So I would also like to thank our audience for the questions here and for taking time to join us today for the webinar. As I mentioned, the recording and the slides will be made available on ICMA's website. If you do have any further questions or would like to get involved, then do get in touch. Thanks again, and bye for now.